The first time my parents told me, money isn't everything. It was said with this calm, almost rehearsed disappointment, like they were imparting some ancient wisdom instead of brushing off the fact that I was barely keeping my head above water. I remember the exact moment because I was sitting at their kitchen table, staring at a mug of coffee I hadn't touched, trying to figure out how to explain that I wasn't asking for luxury or handouts. I was asking for a little understanding. My name's Dean. I'm 32 now, but at the time of this story, I was 31 and already felt about 10 years older than that. Life had a way of doing that to me. I've always been the responsible one in my family. Not the favorite, not the loud one, not the one everyone bragged about at gatherings. Just the reliable background character. The one who moved out early, paid his own bills, didn't ask for help, and quietly assumed that if I did everything right, things would eventually balance out. My parents loved to talk about how independent I was. They used that word like a compliment, but it slowly turned into an excuse. Independent meant I didn't need support. Independent meant I could handle it. Independent meant they didn't have to worry about me. 6 months before everything exploded, I was in a rough spot financially. Not dramatic, movie-style broke, but the kind that creeps up on you. Rising rent, a car that decided to develop a personality disorder, medical bills from an issue I'd ignored too long because I didn't want to spend the money. I was working full-time, picking up extra freelance hours at night, and still watching my account dip into uncomfortable territory by the end of every month. I wasn't irresponsible. I was just tired and scared, and finally desperate enough to talk to my parents about it. I didn't even ask them for money outright. That's the part that still sticks with me. I told them I was stressed, that I might need to make some tough decisions soon, like moving farther from work or selling my car. I thought maybe they'd say something supportive. Instead, my dad leaned back in his chair, folded his arms, and said, "Dean, you worry too much about money. Money isn't everything." My mom nodded like this was the most reasonable thing in the world. "You've always been so focused on finances. You need to relax. Things work themselves out." I remember forcing a smile and nodding along, even though inside I felt this quiet, sinking frustration. Easy to say when your mortgage is paid off and your biggest expense is a yearly vacation. I left that day feeling smaller than when I arrived, like I'd failed some unspoken test by even bringing it up. Here's the thing about my family dynamic. It looks functional from the outside. No screaming matches at holidays. No dramatic estrangements. Just layers of subtle favoritism and expectations that everyone pretends not to see. I have a younger sister, Melissa, who's 28. She's always been taken care of. If she needed help, it was framed as support. If I needed help, it was framed as weakness. My parents would never admit that, but patterns don't lie. Melissa moved back home after college, temporarily. That temporary situation lasted for years. They covered her car insurance, helped with her student loans, and brushed it off with, "She's still finding herself." When I moved out at 19, my dad shook my hand like I was joining the military. Different standards. Same household. So when 6 months passed after that kitchen table conversation, I honestly thought the whole "money isn't everything" speech was behind us. I was grinding through it, slowly stabilizing, still stressed, but managing. Then my mom called me one evening and said, "Your father and I need to talk to you. Can you come over tomorrow? It's important." That word, important, should have been my first warning. I showed up the next night, expecting maybe a family discussion about holidays or something related to Melissa. Instead, they had that serious posture people get when they've already decided something and just need you to accept it. My dad gestured for me to sit. My mom clasped her hands together like she was bracing herself. "We're going to need your help with something," my mom started. I felt that familiar tightening in my chest. "Okay, what kind of help?" They exchanged a look. My dad cleared his throat. "Your sister is planning a big step in her life." That alone could have meant anything. Moving out. A new job. A relationship. I nodded, waiting. "She's finally ready to buy a place," my mom said, smiling like this was a shared victory. "It's a great opportunity." I did some quick mental math. Housing prices were insane. Melissa didn't exactly have a stellar savings record. "That's good for her," I said carefully. "And," my dad continued, "we've decided as a family to make sure she doesn't miss this chance." There it was. That phrase. As a family. My mom leaned forward. "This is non-negotiable," she said gently, like she was talking to a child. "We need you to contribute." I actually laughed, because I thought she had to be joking. Contribute how? My dad said it like it was obvious. Financially. I stared at them, waiting for the punchline. None came. You can afford it, my mom added, almost casually. That sentence landed harder than anything else they'd said. You can afford it. After months of telling me money wasn't everything. After dismissing my stress. After watching me juggle and sacrifice in silence. Suddenly, my finances were very much their business, and apparently, their resource. I tried to explain. Calmly at first. I told them I was still recovering financially. That I was finally getting some breathing room, but nowhere near comfortable. My dad frowned, disappointed. Dean, this isn't about comfort. It's about family. My mom sighed. You're always so focused on what you don't have. Look at the bigger picture. I felt heat creeping up my neck. That mix of anger and disbelief that makes it hard to find the right words. They talked like this was a small favor. Like they hadn't just decided, without asking, that my role was to fill in the financial gaps for decisions I had no say in. How much are we talking about? I asked. They told me the number. And that's where my stomach dropped, because it wasn't a few hundred. It wasn't even a few thousand. It was the kind of amount that would erase every bit of progress I'd made and shove me right back into survival mode. Also, Melissa could have a nicer place. Also, my parents could feel generous without actually stretching themselves. I remember sitting there, nodding slowly, feeling something shift inside me. Not explode yet, just crack. Because in that moment, I realized this wasn't about money at all. It was about entitlement, about expectations, about the role they'd quietly assigned me years ago without ever asking if I agreed to play it. And as they kept talking about deadlines, about what Melissa deserved, about how proud they were of her, I felt this cold clarity settle in. They thought this was done, decided, non-negotiable. I didn't argue with them that night. That's the part people always find strange when I tell this story later. They expect shouting, slammed doors, some dramatic speech. Instead, I sat there quietly while my parents talked through numbers, timelines, and expectations like they were discussing a shared household expense instead of volunteering my future. I nodded when appropriate. I asked neutral questions. I even said, "Let me think about it," which my mom translated immediately into agreement. On the drive home, I replayed the conversation over and over. Not just the words, but the tone, the certainty. The way "you can afford it" had been delivered as fact, not opinion. They hadn't asked if I was willing. They hadn't asked what it would cost me personally. They'd decided, and now my role was to comply. That night, I barely slept. I lay there staring at the ceiling, doing math in my head, wondering which bills I could delay, which plans I'd have to cancel, how many months it would take to recover if I actually went through with it. And underneath all of that was something heavier than stress. It was the realization that my parents genuinely believed my resources were available to them. Not borrowed. Not requested. Available. The next morning, Melissa texted me. "Mom said you're helping with the place." "Thank you." 3 exclamation points. No question mark. No, "Are you okay with this?" Just confirmation that the decision had already traveled down the family line as settled fact. I stared at the message for a long time before responding with something neutral. "We still need to talk about details." She replied with a thumbs up emoji, and "Dad said it's handled." That was the first real crack. Because if my own sister believed this was handled, it meant the narrative had already been framed without me in the room. I wasn't a person making a choice. I was a solution. Over the next few weeks, the pressure didn't come all at once. It came in polite waves. My mom would call and casually mention Melissa's excitement. My dad would bring up how competitive the housing market was and how timing was everything. Melissa would forward listings she liked, complete with comments like, "This one's perfect, right?" Each message carried the same unspoken assumption. This was happening. I tried to push back gently at first. I explained again that the amount they wanted was more than I could realistically give without putting myself at risk. My mom sighed like I was being dramatic. "Dean, you're single. You don't have kids. You'll bounce back." That sentence stayed with me. "You'll bounce back." Like I was a rubber ball, not a person. Like my stability was less important because no one else depended on me. Meanwhile, I started noticing other things. Small things that added up. My parents had quietly paid for upgrades on Melissa's future place. Inspections, consultations, fees. Things they could afford but had apparently decided not to cover fully because, in my dad's words, everyone should contribute. Everyone, in this case, meant me. At a family dinner one Sunday, Melissa talked openly about how lucky she was to have such supportive parents. She thanked them repeatedly. She didn't look at me once, not even when my mom added. And of course, Dean's pitching in too. Family sticks together. I felt like I was watching myself from the outside, smiling, nodding, playing along. Inside, something was tightening, coiling up slowly. The breaking point didn't come from one big argument. It came from a series of realizations that stacked on top of each other until I couldn't ignore the pattern anymore. A week later, my car finally gave up. The repair estimate was bad, really bad. I called my dad, partly for advice, partly because some naive part of me still hoped he'd say, "Focus on yourself first." Instead, he said, "That's unfortunate timing. Just don't let this interfere with the commitment we discussed." Commitment. Like I'd signed something. I hung up and sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel, feeling this sharp, almost physical sense of betrayal. They knew I was struggling. They knew I was stretched thin. And still, the priority wasn't my stability. It was keeping Melissa comfortable. That night, I opened my banking app and looked at my savings. The number was modest, but it represented years of discipline. Saying no to trips, driving an old car, working late nights. It wasn't just money. It was proof that I could take care of myself. And they wanted it. Not because they needed it to survive, but because it made things easier for them. I decided I needed clarity. Not hints. Not gentle deflection. Real answers. So I asked for another sit-down. When I arrived, they were already prepared. Papers on the table. Numbers written down. A printed breakdown of costs. I should have realized then how far ahead they'd planned without me. "I can't give that amount," I said, finally firm. "It would put me in a bad position." My mom frowned. "You're exaggerating." "I'm not," I said. "I've shown you my numbers." My dad tapped the paper. "You have savings." "For emergencies," I replied. My mom smiled thinly. "This is an emergency." For Melissa, that was it. That was the moment my patience snapped into something colder and clearer. "So my emergencies don't count?" I asked. My dad's voice hardened. "Dean, don't make this about you." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "It is about me. It's my money." The room went quiet. I'd crossed an invisible line. The tone shifted immediately. "You're being selfish," my mom said. "After everything we've done for you." I wanted to ask what that was. The early independence? The emotional distance? The lectures instead of help? But I held it back. "I'm asking for boundaries," I said. "That's not selfish." My dad leaned forward. "We raised you better than this." That one hurt, because it implied that disagreement was failure, that obedience was virtue. Then came the betrayal. The thing that, even now, still makes my stomach tighten when I think about it. My mom reached into her purse and pulled out a folder. "We didn't want to do this," she said. "But since you're being difficult, we need to be transparent." She slid the folder across the table. Inside were documents. Financial ones. Old ones. Statements. Transfers. Records. Things I recognized. Money I'd given them years ago. Not loans. Gifts. Help when they said they needed it. Emergency contributions. Support I'd offered freely, believing it was temporary. My dad looked me dead in the eye and said, "You already owe us. This just balances things out." I felt the air leave my lungs. They hadn't forgotten. They'd kept track, not as gratitude, as leverage. In that moment, I understood everything. This wasn't about helping Melissa. This was about control, about settling imaginary scores, about reminding me that no matter how independent I thought I was, they still believed they owned a claim on my life. I closed the folder slowly, my hands shaking just enough that they noticed. And that's when I realized this wasn't just a disagreement anymore. It was a line in the sand. And whichever side I chose next was going to change everything. I left their house that night without another word. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I finally understood that nothing I said would matter. The folder sat heavy in my hands as I walked to my car, like physical proof that I'd never actually been a son to them in the way I thought I was. I was an asset, a contingency plan, a backup wallet they could open whenever it suited them. The drive home was a blur. I don't remember the streets or the traffic lights. I just remember this hollow feeling in my chest, like something essential had been pulled out, and I hadn't noticed until it was gone. I'd spent years telling myself that my parents were fair, just a little old-fashioned, a little emotionally stiff. That night killed that illusion completely. For the next few weeks, everything unraveled quietly. I didn't announce that I was pulling away. I didn't make some dramatic declaration about cutting contact. I just stopped engaging. I stopped responding immediately. I stopped volunteering information. I stopped showing up to Sunday dinners with forced smiles and half-truths about how I was doing. And in return, the tone of their messages changed. My mom started sending guilt-laced texts. "We're just worried about you. Families help each other. Your sister is under so much stress right now." My dad's messages were shorter, colder, practical. "We need an answer. Deadlines don't wait. Don't make this harder than it has to be." Melissa didn't reach out at all. Not once. Not to ask how I was doing. Not to check in after what she knew had been a tense conversation. The silence from her hurt more than the pressure from my parents. It confirmed what I already suspected. As long as the outcome favored her, my feelings were irrelevant. At the same time, my own life started slipping. The car repair wiped out what little buffer I had left. I dipped into my savings just to stay afloat. I started skipping meals without really meaning to, telling myself I wasn't hungry when the truth was I was anxious. Sleep became inconsistent. Some nights I crashed from exhaustion. Other nights I lay awake replaying conversations in my head, wondering how I'd missed the signs for so long. There was a stretch of about 2 weeks where I genuinely felt like I was failing at adulthood. Not in a dramatic way, but in that quiet, creeping way where everything feels fragile. One missed paycheck. One unexpected expense. One wrong decision. And through all of that, the folder sat on my desk. I didn't open it again at first. I didn't need to. I already knew what was inside. But just knowing it was there felt like a weight. Like a reminder that my generosity had been cataloged, reduced to numbers, stripped of context. One night, after another tense call with my dad where he reminded me that time was running out, I finally hit a wall. I sat on the edge of my bed and just stared at the floor. No phone. No distractions. Just me and the reality I'd been avoiding. I realized something uncomfortable in that moment. I was exhausted because I'd spent my entire adult life trying to prove I was worthy of respect from people who benefited from me not having any boundaries. That thought didn't magically fix anything, but it did shift something internally. It made me angry in a way I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. Not explosive anger. Focused anger. The next day, I did something small but important. I booked an appointment with a financial advisor. Not because I suddenly had extra money to invest, but because I needed someone objective to tell me where I stood without emotional baggage attached. I needed facts, not family narratives. Sitting in that office, laying out my situation to a stranger, was strangely grounding. No judgment, no guilt, just numbers and options. "You're stretched," she told me honestly, "but you're not irresponsible. And you're definitely not in a position to take on someone else's major expense." Hearing that out loud felt like permission to trust my own instincts again. I started making changes. Quiet ones. I cut unnecessary expenses ruthlessly. I renegotiated a few bills. I took on an extra freelance contract that I'd been hesitant to accept before because it meant more late nights. I told myself it was temporary. A way to stabilize. A way to breathe. I also stopped answering my parents' calls for a while. That was harder than the financial stuff. Every unanswered call came with a spike of anxiety. Every ignored message felt like I was breaking some unwritten rule. But the space gave me clarity. For the first time, my decisions weren't being filtered through what they would think or expect. Something else happened during that period that I didn't anticipate. I started feeling lighter. Not happier exactly, but steadier. More grounded. I woke up knowing that the day's stress would come from my own responsibilities, not from managing other people's disappointment. A month passed. Then 2. My parents' messages shifted again. Less demanding. More confused. My mom started asking if I was okay. My dad asked if I'd given any more thought to the situation. I responded politely but vaguely. Still figuring things out. Focusing on work right now. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I didn't justify. Melissa finally texted me after almost 3 months of silence. "Are you mad at me?" I stared at that message for a long time. There were a dozen responses I could have sent. Sarcastic ones. Angry ones. Long explanations. I typed and deleted several drafts before settling on something simple. "I'm taking care of myself right now." She didn't reply. Around that time, something unexpected happened at work. One of my freelance clients referred me to a larger project. Bigger scope. Better pay. Long-term potential. It wasn't life-changing money overnight, but it was stability. It was momentum. I poured myself into it. Late nights. Early mornings. Focused effort. For the first time in months, the work felt rewarding instead of draining. I wasn't just surviving, I was building again. My savings stopped shrinking. Slowly, it started growing. My stress didn't disappear, but it became manageable. I felt capable again. And with that came something even more important: self-respect. I stopped viewing myself as the difficult one for saying no. I stopped replaying my parents' accusations in my head. I saw them for what they were: tools to maintain control. The folder came out again one evening. This time, I opened it calmly. I went through every page carefully. Dates, amounts, context. I remembered the circumstances around each contribution, the emergencies, the promises, the gratitude that had existed in the moment and vanished later. I realized then that they hadn't kept those records to protect themselves. They'd kept them to use against me if they ever needed to. That understanding didn't crush me like it would have months earlier. Instead, it clarified something crucial. They thought they had leverage. They didn't realize that by showing me exactly how they viewed our relationship, they'd given me something far more valuable than guilt. They'd given me certainty. And as my life slowly stabilized and my confidence returned, I started to see the situation not as a crisis, but as a turning point. I wasn't at the end of the story yet, not even close. But for the first time since that night at their kitchen table, I wasn't afraid of what came next. Once my footing felt solid again, the way I looked at my family changed completely. Not in a dramatic, villain origin way. It was quieter than that. Colder. Like stepping back from a painting and finally seeing the full composition instead of the single brushstrokes that used to confuse you. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was observing. The first thing I did was stop explaining myself entirely. That sounds small, but for someone like me, it was massive. I'd spent my entire adult life justifying my choices to my parents. Where I lived, how I spent my money, why I said yes or no to things. Once I stopped offering explanations, their reactions became interesting. My mom started calling more frequently, but the tone was different, less confident. She'd open with casual questions, then slowly steer the conversation toward finances, Melissa's situation, or how tight things were becoming. I'd listen. I'd respond politely. I'd give nothing away. My dad tried a different approach. He became reasonable, or at least what he thought reasonable looked like. He framed things as discussions instead of demands. "We just want to find a solution that works for everyone," he said during one call, as if the previous months hadn't happened. I agreed with him, calmly. So do I. That answer seemed to unsettle him more than outright refusal ever had. Behind the scenes, I started doing something I should have done years earlier. I started documenting everything. Not obsessively, not emotionally, just factually. I saved messages. I noted dates and times of conversations. I wrote down what was said, who said it, and how it was framed. I didn't know exactly what I'd need it for yet, but instinct told me that clarity was my ally now. I also revisited those old financial records with a more critical eye. I noticed something I'd missed before, back when guilt had fogged my thinking. Several of the amounts my parents claimed I owed them were either misrepresented or outright false. Money I'd given freely had been reframed as advances. Help I'd offered during emergencies had been rewritten as obligations. That realization didn't make me angry anymore. It made me cautious. I scheduled a meeting with a lawyer. Not to start a war, just to understand my position. I brought the folder. I brought my notes. I explained the situation without embellishment. He listened quietly, then said something that stuck with me. "They're counting on your emotional compliance," he said. "Legally, they don't have much. But emotionally, they think you'll fold." That sentence felt like someone turning on a light. Over the next few weeks, I started setting boundaries in ways that couldn't be argued with. I didn't announce them. I lived them. When my mom asked if I could temporarily cover one of Melissa's expenses, I said, "No, that doesn't work for me," and changed the subject. When my dad hinted that deadlines were approaching, I responded, "I'm aware," and left it at that. They didn't know how to handle that version of me. The version that didn't argue, didn't defend, didn't react. Melissa, on the other hand, started to panic. She reached out again, this time with longer messages. She talked about stress, about pressure, about how our parents were on her constantly. She framed herself as caught in the middle, as if she hadn't benefited from every single decision made so far. I listened. I sympathized. I still didn't commit to anything. That's when she made her mistake. One evening, she called me instead of texting. Her voice was tight, rehearsed. "I just need to know," she said. "Are you going to help or not? Because Mom and Dad already told the realtor you're covering part of the down payment." There it was. Not a misunderstanding. Not confusion. A confirmed assumption presented as fact. I thanked her for telling me. Calmly. Almost pleasantly. After we hung up, I sat there for a long time, staring at my phone. Not shaking. Not spiraling. Just thinking. They had made commitments on my behalf. Financial ones. To third parties. Without my consent. That wasn't just entitlement anymore. That was recklessness. And for the first time, I saw a path forward that didn't involve yelling or dramatic ultimatums. It involved letting them feel the consequences of their own assumptions. I waited. That was the hardest part. Not reacting immediately. Letting things progress naturally while I quietly prepared. I continued building my financial cushion. I secured the long-term contract at work. I updated my budget. I made sure that if things escalated, I wouldn't be scrambling. Stability was my shield now. At the same time, I started reconnecting with people I'd unintentionally sidelined over the years. Friends, colleagues, people who knew me outside the context of family roles. Talking to them reminded me who I was when I wasn't being managed or minimized. One of those friends worked in real estate law. Over coffee, I casually mentioned my situation. I didn't ask for advice directly. I just listened as he talked through common scenarios. "People get into trouble when they assume funding," he said, "especially when that funding isn't formalized." I nodded, filed that away. My parents' behavior grew more erratic as deadlines approached. My mom oscillated between sweetness and subtle threats. "I don't know how we'll explain this to Melissa if you back out." My dad started referencing family reputation and trust. I kept my responses consistent. Neutral, calm, non-committal. Inside, though, I was aligning pieces. I knew the exact date Melissa planned to make her offer. I knew which realtor she was working with. I knew what my parents had promised and, more importantly, what they hadn't actually secured. They believed pressure would force me into compliance at the last minute. They believed I'd cave rather than embarrass them. They were wrong. I didn't want revenge fueled by anger. I wanted something cleaner. Something that would expose the truth without me having to raise my voice. And then, just days before everything was supposed to be finalized, my dad sent me a message that confirmed I'd timed this perfectly. "We've assured everyone you're in. Don't make us look foolish." I stared at that sentence for a long time. Not because it scared me, but because it proved, beyond any doubt, that this had never been about family. It had always been about image, control, and the assumption that I would sacrifice quietly so they wouldn't have to explain themselves. I set my phone down, leaned back in my chair, and took a slow breath. They thought the next move was mine because they'd cornered me. What they didn't realize was that the corner they'd pushed me into was exactly where I needed to be. Everything was in place now. I just had to decide when to let it unfold. The morning everything collapsed, I woke up calm. Not the shaky, forced calm I'd been pretending to have for months, but the real kind. The kind that comes when you already know how something is going to end and you've made peace with it. I didn't rush. I made coffee. I reviewed my notes one last time. Then I waited. By mid-morning, my phone started lighting up. First it was my mom. "Call me. Urgent." I didn't. Then my dad. "We need to talk. Now." I let it ring. The third call was from a number I didn't recognize. I let that one go to voicemail too. I wasn't being petty. I was being precise. An hour later, Melissa called. She sounded panicked in a way I'd never heard before. Her voice cracked halfway through the first sentence. "Dean, what's going on? The realtor says the funds aren't confirmed. Mom and Dad said you already transferred." I interrupted her gently. "I never agreed to that." Silence. "You what?" she asked. "I never agreed to fund anything," I said calmly. "I told you I was taking care of myself right now. I never authorized a transfer. I never signed anything." She started talking faster, words tumbling over each other. Deadlines. Deposits. Commitments. How embarrassing this was going to be. How everyone was waiting. I listened until she ran out of breath. Then I said, "That sounds like something you should talk to Mom and Dad about." She hung up on me. That was when I finally called my parents. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I didn't argue. I simply asked them to explain, slowly, how they'd assured third parties of money that wasn't theirs to promise. My dad tried to bulldoze through it at first. He talked about expectations, about family obligations, about how I was putting everyone in a terrible position. I let him finish. Then I said, "I told you no. Repeatedly. You chose to ignore that because you assumed pressure would work. My mom tried a different angle. Tears. Guilt. How could I do this to my sister? How could I let things get this far? That wasn't my doing, I replied. That was yours. She gasped like I'd slapped her. I documented everything. I continued, still calm. Every message. Every call. Every time I said I wasn't committing. I also spoke to a lawyer. And if anyone suggests, even indirectly, that I'm legally responsible for this situation, I'll defend myself accordingly. The line went dead quiet. That was the moment the power shifted. Not because I threatened them, but because they finally realized I wasn't bluffing. I wasn't emotional. I wasn't confused. I was prepared. What happened next unfolded quickly, and none of it required me to lift a finger. The realtor demanded confirmation of funds. There were none. The offer fell through. Fees that my parents had confidently brushed off suddenly became very real expenses they were responsible for. Melissa lost the place she'd already started calling home. And for the first time in my life, I watched my parents scramble. They tried to save face. They tried to rewrite the story. My dad told extended family that there had been a misunderstanding. My mom told friends that the market was just too competitive. Melissa avoided me entirely. A week later, my parents asked to meet. I agreed on my terms. We sat at the same kitchen table where they'd once told me money wasn't everything. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. They didn't bring folders this time. No documents. No leverage. Just regret wrapped in defensiveness. My dad started with an apology that wasn't quite an apology. We didn't expect things to escalate like this. I did, I said quietly. My mom cried. Real tears this time. She said they'd only wanted what was best for the family. That they'd assumed I'd understand. You assumed, I replied, that I'd sacrifice quietly so you wouldn't have to adjust. They didn't deny it. That was the moment I told them everything. Not angrily. Not dramatically. Just honestly. I told them how invisible I'd felt growing up. How independence had become a burden instead of a strength. How being reliable had turned into being exploitable. I told them how close I'd come to burning myself out trying to meet expectations that were never applied evenly. They listened. For the first time, they really listened. I didn't demand an apology. I didn't ask them to make things right. I simply laid out my boundaries. I won't be funding other people's lives, I said. I won't be used as a fallback plan. And if that means our relationship changes, then so be it. My dad nodded slowly. My mom wiped her eyes. Melissa didn't speak to me for months after that. When she finally did, it wasn't to apologize. It was to tell me she'd moved into a smaller place. One she could actually afford. There was resentment in her voice, but also something else. Reality. Life didn't magically become perfect after that. There were awkward holidays. Stiff conversations. A new distance that took time to navigate. But something fundamental had changed. They stopped asking. They stopped assuming. And most importantly, I stopped explaining. The money I protected didn't just rebuild my savings. It rebuilt my sense of self. I advanced at work. I stabilized. I planned a future that wasn't built around compensating for someone else's expectations. The last thing my dad ever said to me about that situation still echoes in my head. We didn't realize how much we were asking of you. I looked at him and replied, You did. You just didn't think it would cost you anything. I left that house that day lighter than I'd felt in years. Not because I'd won, but because I'd finally stopped losing myself to keep everyone else comfortable.